Chris Rock, the man whose laughter carried more than just humor, it carried truth. The world knows him as the fearless comedian, the voice that cut through the noise of the world, unafraid to speak the hard truths we often avoid. But his journey to that stage wasn't built on smooth roads or silver spoons. It was forged in the fires of struggle, pain, and moments that no one could see behind the jokes. Born in the small town of Andrews, South Carolina, Chris wasn't destined for fame. His early years were painted in the raw colors of hardship. When his family moved north to Brooklyn in search of the American dream, they found little more than a cramped apartment and the cold bite of reality. His father worked long, exhausting hours as a truck driver, and his mother, a social worker, spent her nights in homes too broken to fix. The kitchen smelled of metal and chalk, a blend of toil and fleeting hope. Yet even amidst all the struggle, something in Chris's heart never stopped hoping. But it wasn't all hope. As a child, he lived with an unspoken pain that only silence seemed to understand. By 10, he was bused to a new school as part of a desegregation program. But what was meant to be an opportunity soon turned into a battleground. He found himself one of the only black kids in a sea of unfamiliar faces that mocked him, ignored him, and, at times, beat him. He didn't tell his parents. These bruises were his alone to bear. And so he learned to stay quiet, to shrink into the shadows. But deep down, he began to recognize that silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was his shield. The laughter of others, so loud and uninvited, became the soundtrack to his isolation. At 13, Chris decided it was safer not to speak than to be heard. The Brooklyn streets weren't kind, and by then every joke he cracked was just a defense mechanism. He didn't know it yet, but that quiet would soon turn into his greatest weapon. By 18, Chris was already learning the rhythm of survival. The streets, the late-night subway rides, the cold apartments, each one a part of his ongoing education in the harshness of the world. Yet there was a fire inside him. Even when there was nothing to eat, he always had his notebook full of jokes. Comedy was more than an escape. It was his lifeline. When he was young, Chris didn't dream of the spotlight. He dreamed of surviving the night, of making it to the next day. He'd stand outside comedy clubs, sneaking in glimpses of performers who made crowds laugh with ease. But back then, he was a kid from the wrong side of the tracks, too young, too broke to be let in. But his hunger wasn't just for food, it was for something more. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing a chance. And one night, in the midst of his struggle, he found it. Eddie Murphy, already a star, walked into a club and saw something in Chris that no one else did. Not perfection, but raw potential. That one moment would change everything. At 21, Chris found himself on the set of Beverly Hills Cop 2, a small part, a small paycheck, but everything to him. It was the first time someone saw him, truly saw him. It was a validation of every sleepless night, every rejection, every laugh that fell flat. But success, like everything else in Chris's life, didn't come without its costs. Fame is a funny thing. It's loud, it's bright, but it doesn't make you feel whole. It took him years to get there, but when he did, it felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind of expectations threatening to push him over. By 1990, Saturday Night Live was the stage that would truly define him. It was a battlefield of words, each one harder to earn than the last. The writing room was filled with tension and cigarette smoke, the kind of pressure only those who've lived in the margins can truly understand. But Chris was no stranger to hard work. He fought for every moment, every laugh, and sometimes it felt like the only thing that kept him going was the belief that he still had something to prove. The fame came, but with it came a different kind of silence. In 1993, when SNL ended, so did his sense of certainty. He was no longer the young man who had something to prove. He had proven it. But now he was left with the uncomfortable truth that even when the world knows your name, you still have to fight to be heard. So he went back to what had always kept him alive, those small, intimate stages where the crowd could feel his every word. And then in 1996 it happened. Bring the Pain wasn't just another comedy special, it was a rebirth. The laughter came not just from jokes, but from the raw, unfiltered truth of who Chris was. The pain of his past, the struggles, the doubts, it all spilled out into the microphone, and the world listened. It wasn't just comedy, it was catharsis. The roar of the crowd wasn't just applause, it was acceptance. But even as the world applauded, Chris was already preparing for the next challenge. Fame is fickle. It doesn't forgive. He spent the late 90s and early 2000s chasing perfection, chasing the next big thing. But in the midst of the applause, the lights, the fame, Chris never lost the hunger to be real. Everybody Hates Chris turned his pain into a masterpiece. But behind the laughs, the show kept him awake at night. There was always more to say, more to do, and a fear that perhaps he was still running from something deeper. In 2016, Netflix reached out with a deal that seemed like a miracle. It wasn't a comeback, it was a resurrection. When Tambourine aired in 2018, Chris didn't shout. He simply breathed. His laughter, no longer just a tool for survival, had become a bridge to understanding. For the first time, his comedy wasn't about being the loudest. It was about being the most honest. And in that honesty, there was peace. Chris Rock's journey wasn't just about making people laugh. It was about learning how to stay alive when life itself seemed determined to break you. He turned silence into sound, pain into humor, and every rejection into fuel for the fire that still burns in him today. His story is a reminder that sometimes the loudest laughs come from the quietest moments of struggle, and the truth we try to hide is the very thing that will set us free. He wasn't performing anymore. He wasn't there to make people laugh. He was healing. And then came Selective Outrage in 2023, the first live global Netflix special. The whole world watched as Chris Rock took humiliation, twisted it, and turned it into poetry. Pain? It became power. Every headline, every insult, every scar, he shaped into a rhythm that was all his own. And this time, the world didn't just listen. It heard him. Every stage Chris conquered, he paid for in silence. Every trophy, every accolade he held in his hands was bought with sleepless nights. Fame gave him everything he ever dreamed of, but it also took just as much. But when the lights faded and the cameras went dark, there Chris stood alone, beneath the soft glow of one final spotlight. His eyes were tired. His smile was small, not the grin of victory, but the peace of a man who had made it through the fire. He had walked through fire his entire life. And somehow, by the end of it all, that fire didn't burn him anymore. It lit his way. But even Chris Rock, the man who'd endured everything, never could have imagined what would happen next. March 27th, 2022. The night of the Academy Awards was the night that changed everything. The Dolby Theater shimmered in gold, filled with the applause, laughter, and glittering presence of Hollywood's brightest stars. There he was, Chris Rock confident, sharp, in his element, delivering jokes to a crowd that adored him. But then came one line, a quick jab at Jada Pinkett Smith, seated just a few rows away from the front. The crowd laughed, but in a single instant, everything shifted. Will Smith stood up. His face was unreadable at first, but it quickly transformed into something darker, something that burned deeper than the spotlight above them. He walked toward the stage, his steps slow, deliberate, almost surreal, and before anyone could make sense of it, his hand came down across Chris Rock's face. The sound of the slap cracked through the air louder than laughter, sharper than applause. It echoed through the room, silencing everything. For a single unbearable moment, time seemed to stop. Chris stood still, shocked but composed. Will turned away, his face burning with fury, his breath heavy, his eyes still burning with rage under the harsh, blinding light of the Oscars. That moment lasted only seconds, yet it would echo for years. In the silence that followed, the room didn't know what to say. The orchestra stayed frozen. The audience was caught between disbelief and awe. But Chris Rock? He blinked, then managed a faint smile. Not the smile of a man who had been vindicated, but the smile of someone who was choosing to rise above. "Wow," he said, his voice steady, despite the shock that weighed on him. He didn't curse. He didn't retaliate. He didn't break. He did what he had done his entire life and held himself together in front of the world. It wasn't a weakness. It was grace. In that moment, Chris Rock became a symbol of restraint, of dignity under fire. The show went on, but the world had already changed. The image of that slap would replay endlessly across screens, dissected and debated for years, but few would ever understand what that moment truly was. It wasn't about anger. It wasn't about revenge. It was about control, the triumph of restraint over chaos. Weeks passed, and the world erupted with opinions. Headlines screamed. Screens flashed. The noise was deafening, but Chris, he didn't speak. He stayed silent. Not out of shock, but out of mastery. Tony Rock, his younger brother, couldn't keep quiet. He felt his brother's humiliation like it was his own. He defended Chris with the fire of love, shouting, speaking out. But the noise around him quickly turned into a storm. His words became part of the spectacle. He was no longer just Chris's brother. He was part of the chaos. And in trying to protect Chris, he lost his peace too. Meanwhile, Will Smith sat in his dressing room. The golden Oscar statue sat gleaming on the table beside him, a symbol of everything he had worked for, a symbol that now weighed down on him with guilt. The crowd had cheered his name just moments before, but now the echoes of that applause felt hollow. As he stared at his reflection, he saw not a hero, but a man broken open by a single irreversible moment. He would later say that night left him with a scar for life. The world kept talking. But Chris, he kept his silence. For months, there was no interview, no statement. His calm became the loudest sound in a room full of noise. He didn't fight back. He waited. And when the time was right, he rose again. In 2023, Chris returned. Not as someone seeking revenge, but as someone seeking peace. Selective outrage was more than comedy. It was a confession. It was an exorcism. It was art. He didn't mock or scold or gloat. He simply told the truth, and in doing so, he took back control of his own story. And when the laughter roared, it wasn't for the jokes. It was for the grace, for the resilience of a man who had learned the most important lesson of all. Forgiveness, whether given or hoped for, is the highest form of strength. And time, as it always does, softened the noise. As for Will, he spoke of regret, of healing, of learning. He faced his reflection not as a fallen hero, but as a man trying to rise again. That's what forgiveness truly is, right? Not erasing the wound, but choosing to live wiser because of it. And slowly, time healed those wounds. But Chris, he learned early that grief has a way of shaping you. It doesn't break you, it transforms you. His own journey with loss had taught him that. And it was something the world didn't see. The storm that no camera captured. His father, Julius Rock, worked tirelessly, never speaking the words, "I love you," but showing it through his work. And when Julius died suddenly in 1988, Chris couldn't find the words to say goodbye. It's a pain that never truly leaves you, that ache of unfinished goodbyes. But what grief gives you is a deeper understanding of love. It can shape the way you see the world, and in Chris's case, the way he spoke about it. There's something powerful in grief. Something profound. It doesn't fade away. It just becomes part of you. It becomes empathy. It becomes understanding. It becomes the quiet vow to live louder, to love deeper, to never let silence win. We lost a giant. Bernie Mac's passing was quieter, but the pain was deep. Chris often said Bernie was the last link to comedy's golden era humor with dignity and grace. Losing him felt like closing the chapter on brotherhood itself. But through that loss, Chris learned that you never truly lose the people who teach you how to live. You carry them forward with every breath, every word, every laugh. After 2008, Chris's performances changed. His jokes slowed. The silences grew longer. He wasn't just performing to be heard. He was performing to remember. Farley's grin, Bernie's laugh. Those moments lived on in every punchline. Through each loss, the laughter endured. It became proof that love was real. Then came a quieter storm in his marriage. In 1994, he met Malik, a woman who didn't need the spotlight. She was steady, calm, and saw him beyond the fame. Their love was simple but sacred. They married in 1996, and for years their home became his refuge. But fame, long tours, and absence slowly built a wall between them. By 2014, after nearly 20 years, they separated. Chris took responsibility, admitting his mistakes. "I wasn't a good husband," he said. But through it all, he learned the value of presence, not applause. Today, at 60, Chris's laughter is different, warmer, wiser. He still performs, but his greatest joy now comes from his daughters, Lola and Zara, and the simple moments of life. His story isn't about the applause anymore. It's about rebuilding with love, accepting flaws, and living authentically. And through it all, he continues to show up for what matters most to his family. If this story touched you, leave a like or share a comment. Sometimes the greatest applause is for a life lived honestly.